Protesting. Is it pointless or is it just stupid? The answer to that depends a great deal on what the protests are attempting to do. Now, if your plan is to change people's minds, you're not very likely to do so. Meta analysis of sociological papers conclude that the impact of political protests of either changing minds or altering politics is at best inconclusive. That's for the US. Results may vary elsewhere. The benchmark of US protests would be the Vietnam War. Studies find the impact of the protests on politics of the era is also inconclusive. Now, if you were a Vietnam protester, this information will probably cause you to shake your head violently. Surely, with all the effort you put in, you had to have had some kind of impact. Sadly, probably not. Even with the tenor of protests rising, the level of violence in Indochina never waned until the end. Field bombing intensified. The war openly spilled over the borders into other countries as the protests intensified. LBJ didn't run for a second term because of the protests. He discovered he had an inoperable lung cancer tumor and wouldn't live out the term. The Democrats refused to approve a peace plank at their convention, despite one of the largest protests in U.S. history right outside the building. In '68, Nixon was essentially the fight the war better candidate, and he won. Now, mind you, it was a split election, but he still won. In 1972, he won by even larger margins after 4 years of intensifying the war, right in the face of the Vietnam protesters. There was no correlation to protesting intensity versus war intensity. The war appeared to end when the establishment was ready to end it. So, what about getting the message out? Well, unless media or the colleges are already amplifying your message, the protest alone will do little. If there is an idea that the media wants to amplify, they'll cover your protests and they'll basically make you look good while you do it. However, for each protest that gets amplified, there are dozens that get ignored. If your protest is opposed to an establishment interest, they will de-amplify your protest by highlighting the scariest people in the protest, quoting idiots in the crowd, and showing your group at its worst. The Palestinian protests are highly illustrative of this. Initially, everybody seemed to want the protests. The establishment amplified the protests. Then the tide shifted, and very quickly the same media that seemed to be lionizing the protests were happy to show them as fools. So, are protests any good at all? Yes. They can help you find people to grow an organization. People willing to show up for a protest might be willing to show up at a meeting or join online organizing. And that's the bulk of the pointless part. So let's speak a little bit about stupid. Protests are fairly close to being ineffectual. Riots, on the other hand, can change the course of history. Every protest is in danger of turning into a riot. That's because odds are very high that there's somebody either at your protest or looking at your protest who wants it to be a riot. Now, when one suggests that protests can be hijacked and turned into riots, inevitably someone says, "Ooh, conspiracy theory," which is really stupid. Despite the fact that we have records from the Roman Republic and Empire detailing how different factions would infiltrate the mobs of Rome in order to stoke their passions or calm them down. We also have primary sources documenting the French Revolution, mentioning hired professionals working the crowds to turn protests into violent events. The storming of the Bastille is actually a very good example of that. The left itself provides decent first-hand accounts of how the police and FBI infiltrated the protests of the 60s and 70s. So, infiltration is very real and has been with us a long time. The type of people who hijack protests are more or less of two types. I'll call them vandals or provocateurs. Vandals are usually loners, maybe a small, unconnected group that just want to fight or burn or break things. Provocateurs are people who are either government or a member of an organization who have training in how to manipulate groups into changing their behavior. Again, as I said, this has been known, how to do this is something that's been known for a long time. It just takes a little bit of training from the right people. So, what is the goal of a provocateur? In many cases, they trigger events for the purposes of discrediting the group that they've infiltrated. This was a very common reason for police infiltration of Vietnam era protest groups. Another provocateur goal is to trigger government overreaction. In a stable place like the US, an overreaction, like killing protesters, may force the government to grant concessions. In places with less stable establishments, this can lead to revolution or even civil war. Often, the government will refuse to act in order to avoid creating an incident. This is why most US race riots are allowed to just burn down a section of the town. It's a calculated cost benefit analysis. Lose a few city blocks, avoid triggering an incident that might make things worse. Now, keep in mind, just because the likelihood of a revolution is unlikely in the US, the provocateur may still have revolution as a goal. So, what's the stupid part? I like to call this peaceful, but or mostly peaceful but fiery protest. The provocateur does not want to die or become incarcerated for the long term. They want you to die or get pranged in jail. More specifically, when you protest, the provocateur has extremely ill wishes for your liberty and life. So let's get really stupid and stand in the street and block traffic. Where does this idea come from? Well, it did start to a limited extent with the 60s civil rights marches. And a lot of modern articles will cite this, but they won't give you full context because it'll ruin what they're trying to purvey or what they're trying to tell you. If you read articles by people that are giving you the full history, you'll discover that most civil rights leaders dislike the practice because blockades make people angry, and making them angry is counterproductive. MLK was on record saying exactly this. The use of blocking traffic was very limited in the 60s and typically was done as a permitted march rather than an impromptu static roadblock. So, if civil rights leaders who gained so much by their 60s activism disliked roadblocks, why are they all in vogue now? Well, we're going to put together two concepts I mentioned previously. First, the government tends to let rioters riot in order to avoid giving them the reaction provocateurs want. Second, the provocateurs want an incident with a dead or wounded person. So, if the government won't give the provocateur what they want, provocateur will attempt to create a situation where a motorist does it instead. So, here's how to avoid stupid. First, listen to your parents' advice. Don't play in traffic. The sole purpose of you being in traffic during a protest is that somebody wants you and a bunch of your friends dead. The cause is important to the provocateur, and your life is something they are willing to sacrifice. When you see people show up in black bloc, leave. Their goal is to perform crimes and be hard to identify. You risk death, crippling injuries, and long terms in jail. They are not part of your group. You are a useful idiot to their cause. If you must protest, always figure out how to organize some form of security for your group. The job of the security detail should be solely the safety of the participants, and they should have no direct involvement in the protesting. With good training, security can basically spot the people who are agitating and basically disrupt what they're doing. And also, when they spot some of their own, and you should really know your core group when you're out protesting, if somebody is getting too passionate, they can move in and calm them down. The best training security can get is from the agitators or provocateurs themselves. As I mentioned in the beginning, even the Roman Republic knew how to inflame or calm down a crowd. So, with that said, any of you ever been involved in a protest? Interested to hear your take on it. What was going on? Do you think you were effective? Did you change the world? Also, any thoughts on the whole standing in traffic thing that's been popping up lately? Curious to hear your thoughts. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please look at my other titles, consider subscribing. And if you know somebody who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.